It's just another day when you open your bank app as you always do, but this time, instead of normally accessing your current account as usual, there is a message waiting for you. Please answer these questions and submit the requested documents within the next 14 days or we'll have to close your account. You don't panic, you decide to send all the documentation, continue doing what you're doing before, and the next day you receive an email. In 14 days, we will close your account. Please remember to remove the funds you currently have in your balance. For those who've gone through this experience, this is definitely not a pleasant event, especially if it happens not just with one bank, not just with two banks or with a random fintech you use for your everyday expenses, but with the serious bank accounts you really relied on to manage your money. It may seem strange, but when you move your tax residence, a situation like this is actually much more common than receiving questions from the tax authority of your country of origin. So I decided to make a video to explain the 5 essential things you need to do to manage your banking situation when you change or you're about to change your tax residency, specifically in Paraguay. The first thing you need to do, even before changing residence, is to map out the banks you're currently using. For each of them, you should easily find on their website their policies regarding accounts for non-residents and residents of Paraguay in particular. If you have any doubts, just talk directly with the support and have them explain what will happen to your account after you have left. You will find that there are 3 categories of banks. The first is those that happily accept residents of other countries and residents of Paraguay. The second is those that accept accounts for non-residents but do not accept residents in Paraguay. And the third is those that do not accept foreign non-residents, and even more so if they are residing in Paraguay. Once you have mapped out which banks you can continue to use after moving your residency to Paraguay, it's time to move on to the second thing: planning how you will change your money management after you move your residency. Ideally, you want to have 3 categories of accounts. First, one more safe account where you deposit money that is in large, extremely secure banks, which will host the majority of your liquidity. Typically, this will be an account at a large international bank or a non-resident account at a bank in your country of origin. Second is gonna be a more day-to-day account where perhaps you move liquidity because they have low costs on foreign currency transactions or are more flexible about buying cryptocurrencies or withdrawing cash abroad or to do other operations that you don't want to risk doing with the safe accounts because they could be blocked or cause problems. Typically, this will be a fintech account like Merux, Sapo, or Ducascopy, but there's many more that we can mention. And third, a small account in Paraguay to be used not so much for the actual transactions, but more so to create an additional tie with the country and therefore improve the substance you have here, just like we said in our previous video. Small tip, it's even better if that's an account that allows you to have your address written on the bank statements, which is actually not common here in Paraguay, but there is one bank, Banco Familiar, that actually provides you bank account statements with the address written down in the bottom right corner. And the third thing to do, concurrently with your change of residency, is to make sure you have an address in the new country where you're moving your residency. In the ideal scenario, it is an address where you are actually living and you really have a genuine long-term rental contract. Obviously, however, we must consider a case like that of Paraguay, where having a continuous address is not necessary to maintain residency here, as well as it's not necessary to spend a certain amount of days a year here to continue being a tax resident of the country. In this case, you can use a service like our concierge service, which offers you a domicile in Paraguay and consequently helps you pass the KYC of financial authorities. Today, my friends, it has become impossible to just live in the clouds. You will always be asked for an address, all the more so if you plan to combine residency in Paraguay with an offshore LLC. Whatever the jurisdiction, both when setting up the LLC and when opening a bank account, you will be asked to indicate your residency address and the address of the beneficial owner of the company. The fourth thing to do is after residency, which is to notify all the banks you used before. Normally, this communication is approved by the banks only after you have already notified the government of your country and the tax authority. So normally, you first cancel the tax residency and immediately afterwards, you give notification to the banks. If you have planned your transition well, you should not have any surprises at this point because you have mapped out everything before. You will then open the account in Paraguay, the other accounts you plan to open, and with all of this, you will have your system in place to be able to manage your banking life from the first moment. And the fifth and final thing to do is to make sure you don't get your accounts frozen and you don't get them closed overnight. The good news is that that's obviously possible. The bad news is that the fifth step is never really over and it actually requires ongoing work. Not having problems with your bank accounts is an ongoing job that requires attention to just a few, but very important things. Banks are interested in three fundamental things. First, your address, which we have already discussed, especially for tax purposes. Second, making sure that the origin of your funds is transparent, and third, making sure that your earnings have been declared somewhere. Regarding the origin of the funds, there are typically two cases for those who come to reside in Paraguay. The first case is that it involves funds coming from their own business, normally structured as an offshore LLC or an employment work. In this case, it is very important to keep track of invoices and contracts with clients, as well as obviously the company documents that prove your status as a beneficial owner. This is undoubtedly the easiest case. And the second case is the one of those who invest. Now, there are two possibilities. The first is that you invest in financial instruments listed on the stock exchange, in which case it is usually enough to keep track of transactions and account statements from your brokerages, and rarely further questions are asked. And the second case is the one that involves cryptocurrencies, and in this case, things get complicated. Fundamentally, things get complicated because at almost every single bank in the world, at the time of a check in the origin of the funds, will ask you where you got the funds to buy the cryptocurrencies in the first place. Does that make sense? So at that point, you will have to trace back to something that is the sale of real estate, a salary, a business you have managed in the past, or something else along with tax returns that is not related to crypto. Ideally, the best thing in this case is to rely on banks like Tower Bank, Ducascopy, or Xapo, which by definition have always declared to be very crypto-friendly and therefore are way less likely to try and cause troubles when you move these type of funds through your account. And the third aspect that concerns banks, namely the demonstration of having declared the funds. That is the slightly more problematic point, especially in Paraguay, because in Paraguay, incomes produced abroad are obviously not taxed, but they can still be declared. Now, my advice is obviously to declare all the income produced abroad in such a way that if the banks of your country of origin ask you to prove that you have declared the funds in Paraguay, then you can just do so. Unfortunately, in Paraguay, the tools for declaring income produced abroad are limited. They're still there, but for this reason, I always say in all our consultations that it's essential to have a very good planning of the RUC. Not just to open it, because it is precisely for the RUC that you can access this type of declarations, but to actually manage it in a very good way along the way in the monthly and yearly tax declarations. Doing things well, you will have no problem banking even after moving your tax residency in Paraguay. Just a couple of weeks after receiving the cedula and coming into possession of a proof of residency in Paraguay, you can definitely manage to have all your bank accounts arranged. Of course, in this video, we did not talk about offshore LLC bank accounts, but if you're interested in a video on this topic, just let me know in the comments. As always, from Asuncion for today, that's all. See you in Paraguay.